Okay, so welcome to this next video in which we are discussing the role of complexins in Huntington's disease. Okay, so far what we've seen is that in our mouse model for Huntington's disease, in these R6/2 rat mice, sorry, not rats, what they have is this mutant Huntington protein, okay, which has these two long polyglutamine tracks, which seems to somehow inhibit the function of complexin 2. And when complexin 2's function goes down, this causes reduced exocytosis of neurotransmitter. Okay, so reduced exocytosis because of how important complexin 2 is in the production, in the exocytosis of the synaptic vesicles when the calcium signal arrives. Okay, so we've seen that if we replace complexin 2 into the neurons of these mice with mutant Huntington, that the exocytosis is restored to normal. Now what I want to talk a bit about is the symptoms of Huntington's disease, specifically the early symptoms of Huntington's disease, where the first major structure of the brain to degenerate to a level that it's actually noticeable and will give you symptoms is generally the basal ganglia. Okay, so I want to give you some insight into what the basal ganglia are and what they're doing. Okay, so firstly, let's begin with a view of the brain then. So a picture of the brain, I think, to start off with. So here's the temporal lobe. Here's the occipital lobe at the back, the parietal lobe, and then the frontal lobe over here. Right, okay, so the basal ganglia are very, very important in voluntary movements, basically. If you decide to do something, if you consciously now decide that you're going to pick up a pen or something, and you're deliberately, consciously thinking about doing it, then this is the sort of pathway that the basal ganglia are involved in. Now, I want to outline a very basic model for how this works. And it is very basic. It's laughably simplistic. Okay, so basically, there is a portion of the brain, of the cerebral cortex, right at the front here, which is known as the prefrontal cortex. So this is the prefrontal cortex. Okay, now the prefrontal cortex is really, it's the executive control of the brain. I mean, the brain does work as a whole, but if you were to point a finger as your best guess to which bit of the brain is the most conscious, the highest portion, it would be the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so when you make a conscious decision to do something, it's the prefrontal cortex, at least in part, majorly, we believe, that does that, at least in this model. So I'll present you the model. Whether it's correct or not is another matter. So the prefrontal cortex decides that it's going to pick up a pen, maybe. Okay, what it's then going to do is it's going to send this instruction. It's going to send this instruction that it wants to pick up a pen to another portion of the brain that sits just behind it, okay? Oh, not this bit here, right, okay? So this portion here is known as the supplementary motor area. Okay, so let me label this up. So let me colour these bits in as well. So the prefrontal cortex is in pink here, okay? And then just behind it, we have this important portion of the motor system, and since we want to do a motor act, since we want to move, this is going to be important, which is known as the supplementary motor area. Okay, so this is the supplementary motor area, or the SMA for short, supplementary motor area. Okay, and for short, as I say, that's called the SMA. Right, now, when the instruction from the prefrontal cortex arrives at the supplementary motor area, the supplementary motor area is going to start building a motor plan for picking up this pen. So basically, if you want to pick up a pen, think about how complex that is. You need to contract the right muscles in exactly the right amounts, basically, at exactly the right times. It's a coordinating nightmare, basically. So you have to stimulate the right muscles with action potentials at exactly the right time to exactly the right degree, basically. So, in order to actually perform that, you need to create a certain combination of action potentials, not only in space, but also in time. So you need to stimulate the right combination of neurons, which are going down to stimulate the alpha motor neurons, which will stimulate the muscles. And you also need to have it arranged in time, so that the right ones are happening at the right time, basically. That complex combination of action potentials, both in space and in time, is what I mean by a motor plan, basically. Okay, so this supplementary motor area is going to start generating that complex sequence of action potentials that you need to send down to the muscles, basically. Okay, and then what it does is it passes it to an area that sits behind it, and now I can rectify my mistake with drawing that line. So an area sitting behind it, coming down all the way down the brain, basically, down the side of the cerebral cortex. This is the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex, so we'll do this in red here. Okay, so in red what we have is the primary motor cortex. So this here is the primary motor cortex, and the primary motor cortex is often denoted M1, so the primary motor cortex. So this is M1. So what happens basically is the prefrontal cortex comes up with this idea that it wants to make the movement. The supplementary motor area starts to generate the motor plan that you're going to need to actually execute the movement. It then passes it to the primary motor cortex, which is then going to send it down the corticospinal tract to the actual alpha motor neurons, which will then synapse onto the muscles. So it's actually going to send the motor plan out. Now, basically, there's a gatehouse. There is almost like a security guard sitting in between this connection. In order to get the primary motor cortex to actually send the motor plan out, you need this security guard to say, okay, you can do it. And this security guard is basically the basal ganglia, which is sitting there and saying, okay, do we really actually want this motor plan to go out to the muscles? Because the supplementary motor area comes up with a huge number of different motor plans, and not all of them do you actually want to go down to the muscles to actually be enacted. And this is why when you get dysfunction of the basal ganglia, such as in Huntington's disease, all sorts of involuntary movements actually become enacted because the security guard is no longer functioning, and all sorts of motor plans that you never dreamed of wanting actually are initiated. So the supplementary motor area is making up loads of motor plans all the time. Okay, it's practicing, basically, making up motor plans all the time. Okay, and not all of them do you actually want to be enacted, so you have this security guard, which is the basal ganglia, to say, stop, you're not going through. Okay, and we'll continue this discussion in the next video.